Well, I'd like to start by saying how grateful I am to the Global Center for Pluralism and for the IDRC for inviting me here and to be with you when the book that we prepared jointly with the center is being launched. It's a great pleasure, and I've seen many faces here of people that I have known for a long time but lost touch, and I'm very glad to see them again. I have 15 minutes, so I want to summarize some of the main points in my presentation. And the first point I want to make is that Kenya's experience with a new and progressive and even revolutionary constitution is of interest to other countries as well. African countries have made many new constitutions in the last 2-3 decades. Most of them are indeed very progressive and cover a wide range of issues, not always to be found in constitutions. So I think that one value of discussing Kenya's 2010 constitution and how it has fared in the short time since it came into force may be of wider interest. I would like to give a very brief introduction to the background of the making of this constitution. I think many people think that the 2010 constitution was a response to the electoral violence that followed the elections of 2007. And during highly contested results, followed by a great deal of violence, when 1,500 people were killed in the space of 2 or 3 days in the most brutal way imaginable, and about 500,000 people were displaced from their homes as a result of ethnic killings. We were then visited by our friends from other countries in Africa, led by Kofi Annan, which brought the warring politicians together and restored peace and made an agreement under which a new constitution would be adopted, which answered some of the problems that had led to the fighting. But the working document for the constitution was the one which had been produced several years earlier, in 2004, through a process which was very participatory and which went on for about 4 years, following a massive public movement for reform in the wake of the end of the Cold War. The process that I was privileged to be part of was perhaps the most participatory process I know of any constitution-making exercise. That constitution was eventually adopted as a result of this agreement engineered by Kofi Annan, not completely in the same form, but very substantially. There were 2 or maybe 3 basic motives behind the making of the new constitution. One objective is to deal with the diversity of people in Kenya, divided by race, religion, tribe, other ways, traditions. And the idea here was to overcome the divisions that had developed essentially since independence, and which had had a profound effect on politics, on the way people related to each other, and led in moments like the elections to a great deal of violence. The 27 violence was very well publicized internationally, but I can't think of single election except the 2002, which was not accompanied by a massive amount of violence. So it seemed important that we prepare a constitution which would bring people together, which would create a more inclusive community, which would bring about justice, because many communities had been discriminated in the several years of authoritarian rule. And so the first project is what I call the people who are Kenyans. How do we define them? How does the Constitution define them? And so we felt that to bring people together, to make them feel they are part of this wider community, transcending religions and cultures and ethnic groups, we needed to redesign our rules about formation of government, about the right to participate, and about the equal protection both of individuals and communities which made up the Kenyan people. And so I would say a very important objective and theme of the Constitution was what you here call pluralism, finding things that unite us and yet cherishing the differences that we have through history, through ancestry. And I often say that, with some exaggeration, that every article in the Kenyan Constitution is trying to balance the general, meaning being Kenyan, with the particular. And this is not an easy task, but we try to deal with that in a number of ways, by giving everybody equal rights, every community being acknowledged in its rights, traditional practices, consistent with human rights, principally with social justice, so no group feels left out, and everybody has a chance to live in dignity. Dignity is a big word in the Constitution, appears many, many times. And so that was the approach as regards the people who are Kenyans. How do we define them? What are their rights? The second objective which flows from this was to restructure the state to reflect this goal of creating a strong Kenyan identity. But we also wanted to redefine the purpose and nature of the state, because we felt that nearly 50 years after independence, we were still a colonial state, by which I mean that our state was based on coercion and not consensus, even though we had the forms of elections ever since independence, not always free, not always fair, not always very comprehensive. But we felt that we had to redefine the values of the nation. We had to set standards by which we would judge the validity of state policies and actions. And a very important element in that was the accountability of the state. How do we make the state accountable to the people, from whom, after all, comes their own authority? And we wanted also a third very important consideration was to restore integrity in the public and private domains. When we began our work on the new constitution, Kenya must and continues to have this position of being the fifth, sixth most corrupt country in the world. And that had colored our politics with a very combustible mixture of ethnicity and corruption. We had destroyed rights and freedoms and a sense of security. And so we wanted also to define purposes of the state, accountability for those purposes to the people in different ways. I don't have time to go through the many provisions that touch on accountability, but it's certainly a recurrent theme, as is pluralism. And so we also wanted to make Kenya a truly democratic state. And so we got most of that. Some provisions were jettisoned in the last stages after the violence of 27, but a lot of the values and aspirations found their place in the 2010 Constitution, which was adopted in a referendum by nearly 70% of the people, despite opposition from major political parties, at least quietly in the evenings, and from the churches, who had their own reasons for opposing it. But people's endorsement was very important, because now Kenyans really feel not only did they participate in the making of the Constitution, but also in its adoption for the first time in Kenya. So I won't have time to go through all the mechanisms that were built in to achieve both the question of pluralism, Kenyan identity, as well as the restructuring of the state, the values of the state and the people. My colleagues will perhaps bring out some aspects of those, but I do want to mention one particular feature, which is what we in Kenya say devolution. It's a kind of semi-federal structure under which power is decentralized to now 47 counties. The rights, the structures, as well as the powers of these counties are now well entrenched in the Constitution. And if you look at our Constitution, you will find it has many aspects of federalism, and maybe not as much power as federal states have in your federation, but very, very important for us, because there was no local government for the last many years very high standards for state office, to eliminate corruption. A number of institutions were established, independent institutions for accountability from state organs. So there were many features which also touched on society, because we also wanted to give women equal rights, which my colleagues will perhaps talk about later on. So all in all, if you look at it, it is a very revolutionary constitution, going beyond the narrow confines of the state, reaching into society, ensuring equal rights for all, both under social rules as well as under state rules. People are very happy with it. What has been the experience of this constitution? Most of the constitution came into effect on the day of promulgation, which was 27th August 2010. But the part dealing with devolution and some other laws which were required came into effect only under the first elections, after the first elections under the Constitution, because parliamentarians wanted the full 5 years, so did the president. So the governmental features of the new Constitution were postponed until the first elections, which took place just about a year ago. So the period of time for assessment of the fortunes of the Constitution is very limited, and one can only be very tentative and see some trends. And hopefully my colleagues will speak more on that, since I am running out of time. What I would say on the positive side is that for the first time, Kenyans are living under a constitution that they adopted, that they helped to frame, of which they are proud. And some neighboring countries have actually copied elements of our constitution. So there is both pride and satisfaction with the constitution among the bulk of the people. I would also say that we have made good progress in the short time on the setting up of devolved governments. It's a mixed, contested area, because also we planted devolution in very infertile soil, marked by ethnicity and by corruption. And some people say, we have devolved corruption and we have devolved ethnicity. But I hope not in the long run. I think people are now feeling they have more control over matters that affect them: schools for the children, clinics, agriculture, if they are agriculture community. And I think there is a sort of commitment to hold their governors and local councils responsible in a way it has not been possible to hold the national government accountable. I think communities who lived along the boundaries, especially on the northern area which bordered Somalia, and along the coast sometimes, now feel truly, or so they say, part of Kenya. When we used to go to these parts of Kenya, especially when we went to get people's views, their first question was, how is Kenya? And we said, well, we are in Kenya. Today, someone was telling me there was headlines in the paper the other day about the senior person from one of those new counties, Mandera, saying, now we feel we are Kenyans. And I thought that was no great mean achievement of the Constitution as we work towards pluralism. But the picture is not entirely rosy. Our corruption continues, in fact, with renewed vigor, thanks to the Chinese capital that is flowing in. Other reasons, impunity, which we try to banish, still there. And I fear to say, and hesitate to say, personified by the fact that people chose, as president and as deputy president, two indictees of the ICC, the International Criminal Court, for crimes against humanity. So impunity is almost writ large in the new government. And so local people also within Kenyan system exercise or enjoy a great deal of impunity. We had very elaborate provisions for approval of members by parliament in the American style, for appointments to senior judicial positions in independent commissions, senior state officers. And a very quick look, glance at how they had done this shows that the dominant element still was ethnicity and not the merit and the integrity of the candidate. If you looked at the last elections, the first elections under the new constitutions, the two defining elements were ethnicity and corruption, bribes. And the Electoral Commission did nothing about stopping these practices. The institutions we have set up as oversight have, for the most part, not been able to perform, either prevented by lack of resources or by other considerations. People's participation, which was a major theme of the Constitution, has not really been allowed to develop, to lead to people's engagement in decision makings, in accountability mechanisms. But I want to end with, one, let's say, positive feature. That's the judiciary. We had a very corrupt judiciary, very incompetent judiciary, and we were able to get through a provision that every sitting judge on the day of promulgation would have to be vetted. Several people were vetted and removed. In due course, of course, being Kenya, the vetting process also got corrupted. And so there are still a number of judges not so honest, not so bright, who sit there. But our Supreme Court is new, and our Chief Justice is new, and our new Chief Justice, who's a graduate of York University, got his PhD from there, has turned out to be a remarkable person, very sharp intellect, good knowledge of law, great commitment to social justice and human rights. And so we are, for the moment, very fortunate to have the beginnings of a strong judiciary with strong case law on constitutional protection. Finally, I want to end by saying one great area of failure which shows that the colonial roots are still strong is the position of the police in our system. The Constitution has a wonderful chapter on security, on state security, national security. But most provisions are honored in the breach, I'm sorry to say. And the police continue to be the strong base for the government. A lot of people get killed, a lot of people get beaten. Meetings lawfully run with permits are broken up if people show too much opposition to government, and the police continue to be brutal as they were brutal in the colonial period. And that, for me personally, is a great worry. I have been looking at many state structures in Africa, and one thing we have not managed to do, because politicians don't want to do, is to uproot, to take the roots of the colonial system of government, which was to punish the people. In our case, to punish the people so white people could come and settle. That continues to be the basis, the coercive power, and not the consent of the people, which so far dominates our national security. But I don't want to end on that note. If we have not achieved all that the Constitution promised, then it's too early to judge. And as I may have said, we had a revolutionary Constitution, but we did not have a revolution. And I think the challenge for many of us, including in Katiba Institute, is to make people fully aware of what's in the Constitution, what's to protect them, and thereby, through knowledge, bring about the necessary revolution. Thank you very much.